Hey guys, Jon Sherwood here with the Unpolished Podcast. Thanks again for joining us. If you wouldn't mind, please feel free to like and subscribe, rate and review the show on your favorite platform. We really appreciate it. We want to continue to get the word out about what we're talking about and what we're doing and what God is doing. Today, we have the special opportunity to hear from my good friend and buddy, Steve Staten, who was a large church pastor and on staff at a large church in a metropolitan area for 25 years. And then started his own consulting business to consult with large churches through conflict resolution and challenges that they face. And now, for the last several years, has been engaged in house church and house church models. And so we invited him onto the show to just talk about what he's learned, what he's seeing, and what he recommends to others out there who may be considering how they're practicing church together. Let's jump in. Steve Staten, thanks so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
That's an honor. Thank you.
So obviously, today we're just jumping in here to talk a little bit about your experiences, about what it's been like for you being a part of a large church and on staff for 25 years, now currently participating in a local house church, doing church consulting work around conflict resolution. And you've kind of had a gambit of experiences around church and around church expression, and you've dedicated your life and your career's work to the Church of Jesus. And so again, just thank you for being here with us, and we look forward to kind of talking through a little bit more what you've experienced. So as we begin, maybe you can just kind of introduce yourself, anything you'd want the audience to know about you, and kind of give a synopsis of kind of what brings you to Unpolished here today.
Yeah, so in the 25 years of ministry between 1987, 88, and 2013, I've led everything from very small ministries all the way up to maybe 600. And then even for a short time, when the church got very large, I led it when it was a little over 3,000. So I've seen a lot of expressions. And so my windows into this subject, John, is in 1987, I was in a part-time role with the ministry, and we were all doing house churches. So we're 700 members, and the whole church was divvied up geographically, a metropolitan church in Chicago, to between a dozen and 24 people, or size groups. And it was a really rich experience. It's different than what we're doing today, but so I'll describe it. The church, the group that we were part of was on the north suburbs, and we had no kids in those days except for our kids, and that was only 2, and everybody was in their 20s except for maybe 4 people that were up around 60 or 70. So it was a little cross-generational, but it was very easy with so few kids. And one of the upsides of that season was we grew through the house church. We were very visitor-friendly, evangelistic focused at that time. And I would say one of the things that distinguish it from what I'm participating in today is I think we were just doing big church small, like there would be a sermon and then a brief communion. Our singing probably wasn't that great. I don't remember, it was so long ago, but I do think we were just kind of crunching the big church experience into a smaller setting and not really embracing what it could be. I don't think we really studied it really well at that point in time. So that's my first, foray into the house church world, but it was good. It did lead to growth, and it's viewed in a very affectionate time and nostalgic time in that church's history.
So let me ask about that, because, often we'll get the questions, from those that really don't have any experience with house churches or micro churches or these small expressions. The first instinct, I think, for most people is it's basically the big church just shrunk down into a smaller size, into a living room. And of course it can be that. And like what you're saying, that was your experience. But what did you experience in terms of the hurdles and the setbacks that you guys faced as you tried to miniaturize this, sort of more traditional church expression. You mentioned that there was a sermon. So was every house church, preaching a sermon, and who was doing those, and were they creating that? And, you mentioned the singing and just, not having obviously the most talented pool of people across such a small group of people, like how did you face those hurdles, and how did you try to approach that as you were trying to accomplish the big church benefits in a smaller size?
If my memory serves me right, just about everybody that led one of those wanted to be in the ministry or were in the ministry. So becoming a good presenter was a priority. And I don't think I was a good presenter back in that stage, but I wanted to be, and I took it serious. So we did have our best, speaker teacher types doing those, and probably the same person doing them all the time, because we were literally called house church leaders. And so I think the hurdles would have come if we would have stayed with it, because with, growing families and children and so forth. I think a limitation in our setting, for sure, the one that we were in, is we didn't take communion, the Eucharist, as serious as we should have and as we do now. So I would say that would be significant. I will say it was intimate. We always had food, we had a meal, and people weren't rushing to get home afterwards. It wasn't like, hey, I checked the box. It did tap into that strength of being in a small setting really well.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned just that at that time, the demographics were like really homogenous, mostly all young people, no children for the most part, a few older folks, but it was like a very homogenous group at the life stage that are typically most mobile, agile, available, the typically kind of the least amount of responsibilities. And so there's a lot of opportunity to capitalize on there. If you were to kind of like hit the time travel button, and if you today were to go back and talk to you then, what would you say and why?
I would say you should have a facilitative, interactive aspect to the presentation, and then also rotate those who would like to be in that role. Those who have the gift, you just don't want to do it for doing its sake. But to share that spot, to get more feedback about the subjects that were being presented. What would you like us to study? What would you like us to explore? And I certainly would say either the whole meeting could be around communion, or it should dominate more of the reason that we're there. And so those would be the two bigger things that I would say.
Gotcha. Yeah. So more of a like communal mutuality environment and culture where more people are participating in the decision making, et cetera. And then, the theological underpinning of the Eucharist and that experience together being much more of a focus, a centralized kind of lifted up part of why and how you are gathering, which of course in some traditions is very much there, and some traditions not. I think for many in kind of the broad American evangelical swath, the Eucharist typically has taken a back seat to the sermon for, a long time now, obviously probably a couple hundred years. But in this house church expression, it does perhaps invite and maybe remove some of the hurdles to have a much more participatory experience, even around the Lord's Supper, which when you're sitting in a stadium style room, with several hundred or thousand people, it just becomes almost impossible to have any sort of real like meaningful interaction with the people that you're sitting shoulder to shoulder with. I had a conversation on another episode just using the analogy of a movie theater, that when we go to the movies, we're looking to be entertained, but we're not necessarily expecting that we build some meaningful connection with the person that's sitting 6 inches next to us. Right. That's just not why we're there. And we're all facing in a different direction. And I think, there are oftentimes in the larger church expressions that most of us are used to, or even attracted to, because it does have the most gifted, polished speakers, singers, performers. It can really lack a lot of times in that, sort of personal, participatory, relational connectivity that I think is so it's supposed to be, I believe, my conviction is supposed to be so central to the gospel of Jesus and the body, his bride. So let's talk about this for a minute. When when you tried that, or maybe like, let me just ask, like, talk about the context a little bit, because you said that you guys kind of did this house church sort of expression where you just shrunk the big church into smaller sizes for a time, and that was within a large church context.
Right.
Give me some of the context around how that happened, why that happened, why did it stop, how did it begin? Like, just kind of paint a picture for us on how all that came about, and what you look back on and kind of glean from that.
Yeah, so we rented, when the church was founded in 82, a facility from another church. So we met at 2 p.m, and we grew. I mean, we just grew. And then there was a wall in the building that hadn't been lifted in maybe 80 years to give us even more room to a parlor next to it. And then in June of 1986 was our last Sunday there. We lifted the wall. We knew we couldn't be in that space. So we ended up renting a building where the circus would be every year in Chicago, the Medina Auditorium, but it was very expensive and we couldn't meet there every Sunday. So this was a pragmatic decision to save money so that we would meet as a whole church in that facility downtown Chicago, maybe once every 2 months. And so we were saving money by being in people's house churches.
Yeah. And so, yeah, you bring up the point about finances, and this is obviously a very like rise to the surface type of conversation whenever people think about micro churches, whenever people think about house churches or house church networks. Some of the early questions are, so what do you do with financing, right? Like, how do you do tithing? Because you're not paying for a big building. You might not even be paying for a minister or a pastor to be vocationally supported. And so, like, what do we do with our money, and where does the money go? And then like secondary questions can begin, right? Like, is using the money of the Christians for a facility so that we can all gather in large numbers, is that the best use of our money and finances? And obviously there are going to be varying types of responses and understandings and convictions around that. But maybe you can talk about that for a minute. It sounds like it was kind of a pragmatic thing where you were a little bit forced because like you couldn't find a space that you could afford. So
Right.
then you decentralized and you kind of went into these smaller expressions. But then eventually at some point you abandoned that and went back to meeting all together in the big expression. Talk about that for a minute. Like, what were the advantages and disadvantages of that? Why did you go back to the big church expression? And, what are some of the takeaways of what was good and what was not so great about both of those things?
I wasn't involved in the thinking or decision making to go back into regular Sunday, everybody all together. I would say it was very exciting to do so, just to see the growth of and see the sign of it every Sunday, to see baptisms every Sunday. You don't see that in a house church, but we did virtually every single time we came together to meet. So I think it was for the inspiration component of it. But I can make a comment about money. If we were in strictly a house church situation, and maybe that ecosystem didn't have a central pastor leader, like in your case, that the giving to the Lord is still in the scriptures. But what we did in our house church is we created a nonprofit fund that those who wanted to put it in that fund, they could do other things. They could do a global charity or some other faith-based entity that they felt that was justified to do. But we created one, and then those who did donate to that would collectively make a decision where to funnel that to with needs that came up. And some of it really went to homeless, some of it went to crisis relief situations, but we didn't have any overhead. I mean, the most overhead we had the whole 3 years that we did it in our house, because I'm flashing forward to September 2020 for 3 years, is to buy printer cartridge ink. And we didn't even use that fund to do that. I paid for that. And then one of the members in the house church just ordered a set for me because I was printing everything, in a little speaker system with a microphone to do something outside with multiple house churches getting together. That was $150. Like, there's just no overhead, and everybody's divvying in to bring food for a meal. So there is a lot of cash that could go to kingdom of God things in the house church world, if you're not doing it as a well, if you're doing it purposefully, to be thinking mindfully, there's a big advantage right there of what could be done.
Yeah, absolutely. And, most Christians that I meet, they want to give financially. They want to honor the Lord and steward what they have well. And, most people have been, I would argue, predominantly culturally conditioned to kind of give the quote unquote tithe, to give the money to the church, and the church administers the ministry and work of the Lord from there. But in a house church model, it's often not the case that that's happening, right? That we're not giving the money to a clergy or to staff or to a body of leadership that then is deciding how to best appropriate those funds. Because often in these house churches, whether they're autonomous groups or networks of groups, that ecclesial leadership doesn't exist exactly, right? Sometimes it does, but often it doesn't. And so a question that I hear oftentimes is that, okay, yeah, if I go to a house church, like, where do I give my tithe and what's it going to? And you're talking about, hey, it's a great opportunity potentially to re-envision, where are we giving our monies as Christians, and why? And, and obviously one of the great benefits and one of the great advantages of big church, right, of the traditional mega church of many thousands of people, is that you can pool resources and make much larger dents and impact into society, communities around you. And that's all great. And I know God uses that, and praise God for that. But these smaller expressions where maybe the cash flow is less, it can be much, much more agile. It can be much more specified and flexible and versatile. Like one of my compadres here on the show, James, he talks about how being in a house church is like rowing a dinghy. Like you can move quickly. You may not have many hands and feet. You may not be able to traverse the ocean, but man, you can meet needs quickly. Whereas, the big church is kind of like the cruise ship. It's going to take a long while for that thing to make a 90-degree turn. And so maybe you can talk about that a little bit now, fast forwarding up to, you transitioned from being a big church pastor and kind of on staff in a big church environment to doing your own private consulting work for churches, predominantly big churches. And then in 2020, due to COVID, I'm assuming, you started meeting and experiencing the small church expression, the house church expression. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that. Why did you do that? What's it been like? What's the highs and lows? What would you go back to? Like, if you could press that time travel button in 2020 and go back and talk to yourself, what would you say?
I would say you did the right thing. It was just the right thing. So what happened during COVID, our city ministry in our big church was sending out a link to a communion message that would be about 25 minutes. And not that those were bad or poor, but they were lacking interaction, lacking fellowship. So I'm the only person I knew that right away was just conducting my own Zoom worship, not only with the small group that we led, but with relatives from New York, friends in the UK, Southeast. And so we had this setting every single Sunday morning. And this was an emergency time in our nation. I remember one of the members of our group was a nurse. She had to be at the hospital during this crisis of this pandemic. And she would have the headset and listening to our interactive setting and eventually, occasionally weigh in. So we were doing that while I was part of a big church. Well, for reasons beyond this discussion, we needed to move. We chose to move. Our building sold, so we were going to move to be around our kids and grandkids in North Carolina. So right away, we thought, hey, we can be all together outside around a fire if it's cold, or if it's hot underneath a tree on our property. We have an 8-acre farm. And so we had two of our daughters and husbands and their kids, and then a friend of theirs came, and all of a sudden we have a small house church. And then another two friends of theirs came. So we could meet in the garage, in the barn, in the house, under a tree, around a fire. We did all sorts of crazy things. But while everybody else was still kind of, either starting to dabble with coming back to a meeting place, highly spaced out, or still doing the virtual worship. So that was for us right on. We did the right thing. And there were other house churches in the area that had a historical connection. So we became part of an ecosystem of about 5 house churches in the Triangle, North Carolina area. And I wanted a relationship to bigger churches, so we've dabbled in that too. But so that's our segue. And it was a very interesting experience because we got a chance to do what I didn't do right in 1987. We had, like, focusing on communion. We did studies on the atonement, what that meant in the early church, how communion was celebrated in the early church. We did one study in the Paschal homily from Melito. It's basically a Eucharist communion message, but it's poetic and creative and energetic. And we break it up and rotate the reading of it and discuss what it meant and have bigger emblems, bigger piece of bread and wine or juice, but we'd have
not just
larger
the little wafer cracker with the little like plastic thing that you can never quite get open. Like, it's just so frustrating trying to get to the Lord's body, and you can't. Yeah.
Yeah, it was crazy. But I also made sure that everybody was participating. So I probably led 3 out of 4 of these facilitated. So they would have the scriptures on 8.5 by 11, probably a couple pages, double-sided, and spaced so that people would know where, as we go around the circle and read, where their part was. Questions at the very bottom that we would have. And then they would take them home, or I would email them out, something that I could use again in the future. I did quite a bit of that approach. And we were so adaptive. We were agile, like you said before. I'll give you an example. One of the people that came to our group, his name is Jeff. And he was not a member of our faith. I wasn't sure of his theology or anything, but he was just such a great person. And he said, "Hey, I am going to be baptized on July such and such, and could we study baptism?" So for 2 weeks, my daughter Talia did Old Testament, Intertestament, leading up to John the Baptist baptism. I did the rest of the New Testament on it. And he was getting real clear why he wanted to be baptized. But he was going to do this among a bunch of his evangelical friends. So he pulled the men of our group together about a week beforehand. And he says, "I want you to hold me accountable." So we went through all the reasons. He created a handout. This is why I'm doing it. This is what the Bible teaches for it. I want you to be able to speak truth to me. If you see anything in my life, and so forth. And then we met at a river, and he was baptized. We had about 20 people there for that. And it was so organic. There was no study series used, but there was a lot of Bible, a lot of communication. But it wasn't like a typical catechism approach, which I still do love that approach. But it was the one that met his needs, and it was fantastic.
Yeah, and just that agility, right? That nimble flexibility that you're talking about in the house church that can be able to maybe perhaps meet individuals' needs in a more individualized way, whatever that might be, whether it's, physical needs or financial needs or spiritual needs or theological needs. So, I want to ask you, because obviously you are a pastor, you have theological education and exposure, you worked in vocational ministry for 25 years. And now you can, create printouts, and you can create Bible studies, and you can lead people through theological discussions like the atonement. But not everybody, in fact, most people aren't really equipped or skilled or gifted or called to do that kind of work. So what would you say to the small group leader in a big church, or the person who's doing their best to lead a house church expression, but may not have the gifting or the calling or the equipping to, do some of these more traditional apostolic, prophetic, evangelistic, pastoral roles? What advice, what input would you give them to be able to use the gifts they do have, to use the callings they do have, to, either lead or to facilitate or collaborate in these mutual house church small group expressions? I hope my question makes sense. Like,
it certainly does.
I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of a listener, right, or a viewer, and they're going, Well, that's great, Steve. I don't have 2.5 master's degrees like you. I've never done a study on the atonement, so that's probably not going to be a topic of discussion for us. Sure, I could try to get a bigger piece of bread and be, done with those little frustrating plastic lids or whatever. But, what can I do, right? Like maybe you can speak to that for a moment. Speak to that
Yeah.
person.
Well, even those of us with experience in speaking, teaching, preaching, whatever you call it, will do something that I would recommend for somebody in that situation. And that is find a really meaningful presentation online that would create really good, healthy conversations for spiritual purposes that's biblically based. We did it one time with Tim Keller speaking on the book of Job. It was just amazing. Last week, a former minister chose to have us watch a 12-minute video from N.T. Wright, and it was about communion. And it was so, so, so good. So we are fortunate in this day and age to have these kind of resources available. So I think it's good to shake things up. It could be watching an episode of The Chosen. We did that one time. It could be, a speaker in a presentation, or it could be a number of people talking around a particular subject that's on a video or whatever. But like what I've been doing, though, facilitating a discussion around a passage of scripture. I particularly don't like topical, like you're bouncing over the Bible. I like, let's stay in an event or let's study a character. That helps people that have ADD like I do.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And you mentioned, just we're in a day and age where we have access to so many resources that it empowers, I think, in some ways. It can also become overwhelming for sure, but it empowers smaller church expressions to not have to rely on paying a pastor who did go get 6 years of seminary education or whatever. Actually our microchurch network this year is going through some of John Mark Comer's Practicing the Way platform and spiritual disciplines and spiritual formation practices. And, we're utilizing that resource from him and from his group of people who are teaching on this. And so microchurch pastors aren't having to create this content or come up with it. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity here if we're willing. Of course, we have to be discerning, and, we're always going to be trying to distill, is what I'm being exposed to, sound doctrine, solid teaching, or is it a little out there? And even having a framework to understand, what do I think that means? Like, how do I quantify sound doctrine? And when have we crossed into the threshold of this is sound or unsound? And when do we not, and I think that those are all helpful things. But for this small group house church expression to be able to utilize, so much of the rich resources, Tim Keller, N.T. Wright, Tim Mackey, you've mentioned a lot. But what else would you advise? Like, what other kinds of input or advice would you give to someone who is considering, maybe experimenting with a small church expression? Maybe they're already in a big church, or maybe they don't have a church expression and they're thinking about this. And then what would you say to the pastor somewhere, right, that is maybe considering, hey, maybe we can rethink or reimagine or re-envision our small group structures, or maybe we can incorporate house churches in some way in our big church paradigm. And you mentioned ecosystem. Like, what advice would you have for those people?
I think study and reaching out to others who are doing the same thing. But here's what I mean by this. When I was working on my master's thesis, was on unity in the first 150 years of the church, from the apostles all the way up to like 160 or so. And what I noticed is the pillar churches in the New Testament, Jerusalem, Antioch, Ephesus, Corinth, and Rome, had completely different resources. Like, some had prophets and teachers, some had evangelists and pastors, some had none of the above that we can tell. Like Corinth, we're just dealing with names of prominent people. We don't know what their titles are, although there are very many gifts were emphasized. And then I looked at the structures that were very different because of that, or because of demographics or geography or whatever. So, but the one thing that's emphasized is people met in homes. And Corinth looks like a coalition of house churches that occasionally will come together as a church. And that is referenced in 1 Corinthians 11 and 14. So there was a wholeness with them, but they were separate. Rome is interesting. Scott McKnight's book called Reading Romans Backwards says go to Romans 16 first and then read the rest of the book of Romans, because you see that it's basically a group of house churches. But that whole group is never called a church. And there's a reason for it. They could never pull it off. They were persecuted. And that was true all the way up to the middle of the 2nd century. Justin Martyr, who was part of a house church, didn't even know where the other ones were. Now, he wrote things to benefit these other groups. That's undeniable. But they didn't want to know where everybody was, because when they got interrogated, like what happened to Justin right before he was murdered, they would say, where the other groups meet. And it was to their benefit that they were completely isolated and from being able to be identified by the authorities. But what's also interesting in the book of Romans is they're collectively called the saints, or God's holy people. And then in Romans 15, there's the Greek word homothumadon is used, that there were to be one voice and one heart for Jesus. So there's still a oneness to appreciate each other. When we run into each other, we'll fellowship. But this is very different than Ephesus or Corinth or the other places. The reason I say all that, not because it's messy, but the church has to adapt to the circumstance, and we have to adapt to the circumstance that we're in our location, and we shouldn't be held to a model that's at another place that's not as smart. So first point would be study the scriptures. Look at, Rome and Corinth specifically, Ephesus. And then secondly, talk to other people that are doing it. I've been on quite a few Zoom sessions with people from different tribes, but we're able to sponge and absorb some good ideas. I was on one session with a guy who's been doing this for 20 years, part of the Christian church affiliation. And they started with about 12 members, and now they're, I think, 3 or 4 house churches, totaling around 70. So it's grown, and it's spawned and scaled to some degree. But we learned a lot from him. And one of the things that was important for us to figure out what they're doing with the kids. The kids are a significant factor, and they have to be prioritized as a factor, in my opinion. And so that's where we kind of need some input from other people.
Yeah, I know that's been something we've been traversing for the last several years here, is kind of our approach to children, and how do we instill and expose the gospel of Jesus to our children, and in what formats, and what impressions and understandings of what church is do we want to pass on, and how do we want to pass on our faith. And I'm looking forward to actually talking about some of those things in future episodes. But Steve, thank you so much for being here with us today. Is there anything else on your mind and heart that you wanted to be able to share with the audience as we consider these, your big church and small church experiences over your career?
I would say, first of all, be really clear in one's mind why they want to go in this direction. I don't think it's good to go in this direction because I've had a bad experience that's not been sorted out, if it can be sorted out. So if you're in a good situation, then something bad happens, to just bail on it to go do house church, I don't think that's good. It should be a strategy. Now, you still may need to move into that format if it can't be sorted out or resolved. But it's just to be clear, have I closed the chapter on my last situation in the best way that I possibly can? There's a famous watchdog. Her name is Julie Roys, who's a consultant for these scandal situations. And she became a target of some of the people that she ended up exposing. And I went through her own trauma. And she shares this on podcasts. So she's in a house church where people are in it, have trauma, and they have triggers, and they have to talk about this kind of stuff. So for her, it's a season to find a safe place to work through things. And for deconstructing, that I know that buzzword means a lot of things to different people.
So go ahead and define it. Define it how you're using it.
There's something you want to unpack about what you've always believed or practice, turn the lights on it, ask myself what I still want to retain and carry forth in my faith, but I might be discarding elements of theology or practice, and I need a place in a community to rethink these things where I'm going to be treated well and so forth. So house church can be fantastic for that. But I would hope that all of our house churches figure out how to spin on a dime to do things other than just focus on communion, just focus on healing, just focus on growing and learning through facilitated messages, and think in terms of what are we doing affecting the poor? Do we have a means by which we can reach out to people? House churches can be a way to go to where people are at, get into neighborhoods and places, and meet people that we would have never otherwise met. So I think to be adaptive, but first of all, identify the initial need and close the chapter on the previous place that you were at in the way that you feel you can do that honorably. But just to be clear,
Yeah, to have a strategy, to be able to lean into some of the benefits of small church expression, like being able to have a safe place to pursue healing from trauma, to rethink and deconstruct, perhaps some long-held beliefs or practices. All of these things can be advantageous in the small group expression. But I really appreciate and want to double down and underscore what you said about house church should never be the alternative or choice because you are running from problems, or because you are abandoning, and disavowing Jesus's call to forgive your brother and sister, to seek reconciliation as long as it is on you. And I love that qualifier too, that as long as it is on you, seek peace and pursue it as long as it is up to you, Paul would say in Romans as well. And so, we've got to exhaust all the options that we can, but it doesn't always mean that reconciliation will happen. But not to try to grasp at a new thing or an expression that just kind of gives me a back door out of these other issues. I think that's really, really good, because one of the sayings we have here is that you take you with you everywhere you go. And so if you're leaving problems with somewhere else, you're going to bring them to the next group, and that's not fair to them or to you. And so, Steve, I really appreciate the time. So grateful, and may God continue to bless you and your work and your ministry. Thank you.
Thank you very much.